All right. Okay, ready when you are. Wicked. All right. All right. So, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are thrilled to host Ella Gok. Sorry if I mispronounced your last name. And Sam Price from Herkes İçin Mimarlık for today's 104th Mekan Konuşmaları episode. We deeply appreciate you for accepting our invitation. Thank you very much. Herkes İçin Mimarlık, Architecture for All Association, established in 2011 in Istanbul. It's a platform where students, volunteers, and professionals can come together and bring social problems encountered in country and in the world in a creative way to the agenda, raise awareness about these problems and act to produce solutions from the field of architecture and design. In the aftermath of the devastating February 6th earthquake, Herkes İçin Mimarlık initiated their post-disaster reconstruction plan. The plan began with the proposal for the construction of temporary community center in the area designated for post-disaster emergency housing. This initiative aimed to provide community spaces to facilitate local activities and allow disaster victims to come together, aiding the normalization process. Ella Gok and Sam Price have both been part of Herkes İçin Mimarlık for the past 2 years and are directly involved in the organization post-disaster reconstruction plan through various projects. Sam is currently completing his master's degree in architecture design at Istanbul Technical University. His thesis is centered around craft and repair with Sumer space. I believe it's called like that, yeah. Community center as his case study. Ella, on the other hand, recently received her master's degree having completed architecture and urban studies course at Kadir Has University. She has recently joined Bilgi University Department of Interior Design as a part-time tutor. Thank you again for joining us, and I think the stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much for introducing us. Yeah, I guess we'll start with, I guess, a little introduction to Herkes İçin Mimarlık. I assume most of you probably are at least vaguely familiar with the organization, but maybe for those that are not, we'll just introduce the organization in general, the kind of projects in the agenda that the organization has, and what role it's played since its formation in 2011, 2012. So, yeah, I think the best way to sum up what Herkes İçin Mimarlık does basically is we not only design together with communities, with organizations, with municipalities, with various different parties, but we also aim to build together as well. So part of the main thing about Herkes İçin Mimarlık is this sort of both designing and also being involved in the construction process. And I think that's something that sort of sets the organization apart. And it's also about creating a participatory design process that's more than just a design process, because there's so much that you gain from this construction, this building together, that while it is also obviously involved in the design process, it's much more accessible. And through the process of construction, through the process of implementation, that's where we find lots of the sort of community building or the togetherness as well develops, not just in the design process. So yeah, they're basically trying to find common ground between multiple different parties involved in whatever sort of projects we're working on. And yeah, working through a participatory design methodology, I guess. So, like I said, we'll just maybe introduce a couple of ways that we work, first of all, before we start talking about the post-disaster projects that we've been working on since, obviously, the tragic earthquakes on the 6th of February. So we've kind of framed it in two ways here. The first one we wanted to talk about is process-oriented. Obviously, as an organization that works in participatory design, every project is process-oriented. Every project, the process is very important. But the reason we've separated them out is because for some projects, the outcome is perhaps less important than the process, whereas for others, obviously, the outcome maybe has an equal importance or as the process in itself. So founded around, well, one of the first projects that Herkes İçin Mimarlık was involved in was a project based around the Gezi Park protests in 2013. And that project was basically, what it involved was lots of discussion, forum, coming together, discussing together, using tools that as architects or as architectural students or as academics involved in the field of architecture that we all have or use on a day-to-day basis, and using these tools to bring people together and create a collective space for discussion and a way to represent that and communicate that to a wider audience as well. So yeah, this project, like I mentioned, was during the Gezi Park protest period, and basically involved a whole different range of things, from open calls for participation, which is something that's a feature of all Herkes İçin Mimarlık projects, to activating these spaces, these places, engaging further parties, running workshops, organizing exhibitions, these kind of things, basically trying to create a discourse, trying to open up the discussion, so it isn't just us talking to ourselves, but it's anybody who would want to be involved is able to come and be involved in these skills that we have as architects or designers or landscape architects that are used to facilitate this. Methodology, lots of the things that we do, it's about, like I was kind of saying, making sure that this information is shared. So open sourcing it, or creating leaflets or bits of information that people can understand and digest, and are readable not just to architects, but to the general public or anybody who would want to be involved in a project. So communication is a really key thing. And then in the Gezi Park protests, obviously the outcome wasn't a physical construction. It wasn't, these kind of projects didn't result in something physical, permanent, but it was more about publishing the discussions and exhibiting them and opening up this conversation again, so that it becomes something that everybody can be involved in, and the voices of those people who are involved gain strength and become louder because of this collective collaboration. So maybe...
So as a result of these processes, we can also say we have an output-oriented approach. So we can talk about one of the examples of this, and it's not something that we've actually been involved in, because it's something Herkes İçin Mimarlık's been doing since they began, or maybe a couple of years after they started, and obviously we've been part of them for 2 years, but it was one of the things that kind of introduced us to their approach. So it's really important that we understood it before being part of the organization. So they have a revitalizing abandoned rural schools project. And this involves kind of reaching out, well, to begin with, it involved reaching out to local schools to find out about these small schools that are no longer in use. So maybe they've been just abandoned or turned into something else, and trying to encourage that they could be maybe used as community spaces. And that doesn't necessarily mean actually any construction. It might just mean Herkes İçin Mimarlık going there and offering kind of like volunteer support in order to paint, redo the windows, make sure it's like comfortable through both seasons. And this is obviously very process orientated at the same time, because it involves, although the output is in that the community has a space, it also kind of provides this agency and this encouragement that people can also take kind of collective ownership over spaces, especially if they're being like then disused. And obviously rural schools are the perfect opportunity for this, because they kind of have this existing legacy as a school, so kind of community focused. And so through doing this is a map of some of these projects that Herkes İçin Mimarlık have taken part in over the years to do with rural schools. And map's really important because it also shows how doing this creates this massive network across the country. And this will come into play later when we're talking about the post-disaster plan. But Another part of this networking is that, although to begin with, maybe Herkes İçin Mimarlık, we're approaching schools very quickly. I think, as we learned from our colleagues in the organization, it became that then schools were approaching them. Is how also Herkes İçin Mimarlık got a name and a reputation as doing these projects, and really helps the organization engaging with communities, because we have there's a kind of base of previous projects. So part of the process, open call for participation, as Sam said, a really important part of doing this participatory design is trying to make it as open as possible, not just also to architects, but other disciplines. So placemaking, so again, this is maybe not so much output orientated, but process. So through the process of producing the output, you also encourage this kind of placemaking, establishing community, a sense of community. Cleaning and repairing workshops, temporary use workshops, commoning the resources. So maybe literally the resources of how we do this, but then also like resources in terms of materials. And this I really like. They also made a mock newspaper to inform locals. So they're spreading the information in a way that is understandable to people, maybe is a little bit kind of engaging, funny for people, so they kind of feel like they can also be part of it. And this, as with most of Herkes İçin Mimarlık's projects, involves trying to involve people, as Sam said, in terms of the process at all stages. So not just in the process of design or talking about what we're going to do, making sure people are aware of the process so they're not feeling like it's just coming out of nowhere, but also in the actual building, if ever we're working with a community and we're doing something in their community, we will also encourage or offer people to be part of that process, whether it's building, painting, refurbishing. And then, so part of that's also storytelling, for example, with the newspaper, spreading the word of what we do. So these are some of our projects. So these are often of kind of a small to mid scale. They can be temporary or permanent structures. And sometimes they're just landscaping, sometimes they're furniture. So for example, providing, this project we did last year, providing equipment for children in the schoolyard. And again, this was a project where the school actually approached us and said, we'd really like some new equipment for the school, but we're not able to do this right now. Do you think you could work with us? And so this kind of brings us, we've tried to address the ambitions and aims of Herkes İçin Mimarlık, how we want to be as an organization, how we want to involve as many people as possible in this process. So we arrive at the events of February 6th and how we tried to make our post-disaster reconstruction plan, because obviously there had been a few workshops about like disaster resourcefulness, about how Herkes İçin Mimarlık could be involved, but it was very much, as most of us, we didn't see this coming, obviously, so this was very much something that we had to initiate from the beginning. So something that was so important to the organization, I think, is a kind of credit to the 11 years work of Herkes İçin Mimarlık, long before we became part of the organization. And we go back to that map when we look at the rural schools and see the work they've done across Turkey, is when we started thinking about how we could initiate a post-disaster plan, we thought about what networks do we have in the region. So Herkes İçin Mimarlık actually has members who are living in the region. So we could, of course, once we found out that they were safe, we could reach out to them to try and find out what needs there were. But also then thinking about the fact that we maybe couldn't immediately access those regions. So who do we even know in the kind of peripheries of the area who could kind of support us with, for example, travel, staying there, materials, knowledge, better knowledge of the area. So on the screen, we have 3 of the projects that are completed or almost at completion. So I'm going to hand it.
So yeah, like Ella said, these are just 3 of the projects, I guess. It doesn't kind of cover everything that we've done post-disaster, but in order to kind of make it a bit more understandable, we've started with these 3. And so one thing I guess we didn't really mention, or we haven't spoken about yet, is, we're completely a volunteer-based organization, Herkes İçin Mimarlık, with over 100 members, but because we're completely volunteer-based, everybody has their own work, studies, their own lives. So in terms of the way that projects usually work is it's usually on a short-term basis. So say there'll be a 2-week, 3-week, 4-week long project. We go to an area, whether it's within Istanbul, in another city, in a rural area, and that would kind of be run as a workshop session. And that's kind of the way it worked. Obviously, post-disaster, you have this enormous issue, like incomprehensible issue, but people still have to work and they still have to continue their studies. So one of the first things we discussed as Herkes İçin Mimarlık was, like, what is our capacity and what does it make sense for us to do? And I think when we look back at it, we thought it was like a week after the earthquake or 2 weeks after the earthquake, we'd first got together and started discussing, like, does it make sense for us to do anything? But when I look back, it was actually the day after, or the evening of the day after the earthquake. We got together, we met together. Being part of this association already, you have people with different experiences, different knowledge of different processes, all these kind of things. And we, first of all, were discussing shelter. Obviously, the immediate need after the earthquake was shelter. People's homes, lives were destroyed, and they were staying on the street or in tents, probably not by that stage, to be honest. So that, yeah, or cars, wherever it might be. So our first consideration was shelter, but actually what we soon realized as an organization, this wasn't really something that we had the capacity to address, because it's such an enormous issue, and because if we were to create one shelter, we don't have the capacity to create shelter for 1,000 people. We don't have the finances. We mentioned it before, but our projects usually start with no money. They usually don't start from money. They usually start from an organization saying, oh, we'd like this because we don't have any, we aren't able to do it. And then as an organization, we're then able to use this existing network, this existing reputation, having done these kind of projects, and work with municipalities, other sponsors, community groups, fundraisers, these kind of things, to find a way to make these projects happen. And so post-disaster, we quickly realized that the thing that would be more appropriate for us to look at was community spaces, spaces that we could build one of, but they might be able to serve a larger population, a group, a community, specific group within a specific locality or within the city or within a rural environment. So the three that we're going to talk about, sorry, I went on a bit there, but I just wanted to kind of contextualize that, I guess. The three that we're going to talk about is this first project, Super Adobe Library Space, that is still kind of ongoing, but very near completion, actually. This is one of the first things that we actually discussed in that first meeting following the disaster. Using a technique, we'll go into it in more detail later on, using a technique which uses very little materials. We already had experience within the organization of people that had experience using these kind of natural building techniques, so that was another reason. And the way we chose these sites as well, the way we were able to identify them, was because I think it was 2 weeks after the earthquake, we applied for a small amount of research funding, and a group of members from Herkes İçin Mimarlık, only 4, because we didn't know what the situation was going to be like in the environment. We didn't want to be putting extra load on existing resources, traveled to the area and basically looked at, like, where we might be able to realize a project, where there was existing networks and organizations that might be able to support us to realize those projects, and where they kind of what the situation was on the ground. And it was kind of from this initial research trip that these projects developed, meeting with these organizations. The second one is the Mekan social space. This is in collaboration with the Chamber of Architects in Kahramanmaraş at their container site that they constructed following the disaster, basically a container site for architects, engineers. They also in partnership with other chambers, Chamber of Engineering, Chamber of Engineers, Chamber of Electrical Engineers, various different chambers, to provide them with office spaces. And then the third one is actually the project that myself and Ella are more involved in, so perhaps we'll talk about this a little bit more. And it's also the one that we ended up realizing, first of all, is a community space in Suma neighborhood, Suma Mahallesi, which is in Kahramanmaraş, but was a very deprived area of Kahramanmaraş, with a mix of Turkish residents, as well as quite a high proportion of Syrian migrants from following the Syrian war. And this project was in partnership with 2 main organizations, one of them being CAF, which was a grassroots organization. I think Ara at the back might have something to say about it, became part of it. Basically a group of friends that traveled to the region following the earthquake. And when we took that first, when some of our members took that first trip to the earthquake affected areas, they sort of almost by chance came across this group that were already working and providing these basic needs, but it created that framework for being able to create something, that might be slightly more long-lasting, hopefully. And also All Hands and Hearts, who are completely the other end of the spectrum, international disaster relief organization that work all over the world in various different geographies and disasters, from the US to Nepal to South America to Turkey, so all over the place. And as you can see, I'm not going to go over it too much, but there's all sorts of different methods of funding that we ended up being able to realize these projects through. So working with municipalities, working with civil society associations, and working with also educational institutions as well. So I'll start with the Super Adobe project in Turkolu. It's a medium-sized town, about 30 minutes south of Kahramanmaraş, for those of you that haven't heard of it. This, like I mentioned, was one of the first ideas that we had following the earthquake, that because we realized it would be difficult to get materials, it might be difficult to find people with experience of building, but there was what we identified early on was that there would be a large amount of people wanting to do things, but maybe not necessarily the skills or the materials, or from our perspective also the financing to be able to invest in these kind of huge projects. So the advantage of Super Adobe is you use earth. You don't need very much to do it. You use earth, you use an aggregate, you use a little bit of cement, and you basically pack that inside of these bags, as you can kind of see in this structure, and you can build these dome structures. It's also a technique that has already been, it was developed by an Iranian architect, I can't quite remember his name, but in I think it's 80s, and in California, and it's also been already proven to withstand earthquake conditions, and they've done earthquake tests on it and things like this. So this was immediately a process that seemed like it'd be appropriate. We could realize it, we could work with local communities, it was low cost, it was all these kind of things that we were thinking, okay, this is a viable project. And where we ended up realizing it was in Turkolu, which is an area that was really heavily affected by the earthquakes. The high street there is almost completely destroyed. I think it's over 80 or 90% of the buildings will be destroyed. And we realized it in this small park that's just very close to the city center, basically. So like I said, it all started from this site trip. Actually, all of the project, these 3 projects sort of came out of that initial trip. And also during that trip, we took samples of earth from different sites to try and establish whether it would be appropriate material to use for this kind of construction. Because one thing that's really important is checking whether the earth actually is appropriate. And if it's not, you need to do things to make it appropriate. So adding more cement or all these kind of technical things, obviously in an earthquake area, are really important. You can't just, we realize we can't just go and do this. We need to think about it. We need to make sure it's done in the appropriate way. There was a design phase then. With this project, actually, we kind of opened it up because of the post-disaster conditions. We weren't able to open up all of our projects in quite the same way that we usually would. You couldn't go to the earthquake areas with a group of 30 people and work on a build project. So instead it was working with people, members that we already had, or volunteers that had previously worked on Herkes İçin Mimarlık projects, to try and quickly speed up that process a little bit, because we already had this idea of what it might look like, of this technique, and we just needed to refine it. We were also working with international organizations. CalEarth is where the Super Adobe technique was developed, as well as an Italian organization, a guy called Davide Vide, who does Super Adobe construction in Italy. The first construction phase started in the middle of July, so actually a few months after the earthquake. There was a bit of a extended period where we were checking the materials we were going to use were appropriate, and we were trying to make sure that we were building it in the appropriate way that would be resistant to future earthquakes, etc., and also find the expertise that would help us to build it. So we worked with another organization called Kaluba Collective, who work around Turkey on various different natural building techniques. That workshop, unfortunately, it was a 3-week workshop. It was about 15, 20 people involved, not all the same time, but kind of over 3 weeks. And we were also staying in the park next to the building site, so it was quite an intense period. Also, you can probably imagine July in Kahramanmaraş is pretty hot. So I think that was part of the reason why the process was slowed down a little bit more than we were expecting. Also, with any natural building technique, there's lots of things like using renders and stuff take longer to dry than synthetic materials. So that's why The plastering was partially done during this workshop and then continued again in the middle of September. And actually, just today, we had a couple of our members have returned to Kahramanmaraş who are going there to try and complete the last little stages of it, adding in door frames, window frames, finishing, I think, some internal rendering, and also adding in furniture and stuff before we hand it over to the municipality for them to use. So yeah, I'm not going to go too much through this because it's a bit like everything, but just to give you an idea of how many different parties were involved in even just this kind of small 20 square meter community space project. You have all these different parties involved in financing, design, administration, as well as where the money came from, how we were able to finance it, how we were able to find the materials if we weren't receiving direct financing, etc. So yeah, the design developed in partnership with some of our members who had experience with this kind of construction method already. There's a group called Poçalona Works, who one of them was our member. I think now all of them are now members of Herkes İçin Mimarlık, actually, following this project. And like I said, the idea of this one as well was not only that it's using materials that are local and low cost and we can work with a local community, but also the idea that if we built one, perhaps it might be able to be used as an example because the material is so low cost. You do require quite a lot of labor is the one thing, but because the materials are so low cost and so local, the idea being that perhaps if we built one, it could almost be an example that you work with the community, build one, and then people can say, oh, okay, we could do this same thing. We've already learned together building this project, and actually this isn't that complicated. You could do the same thing elsewhere. It hasn't quite happened yet, but we're hopeful that it might do, and this was also that initial idea is where it came from. It doesn't necessarily need to be where we ended up as well, I guess. So yeah, the construction phase, just a few photos for you to get an idea, working with the municipality, volunteers, also local community. Right next to the site, you can kind of see in the background of some of these photos, there's already these tents and things. The situation kind of changed while we were working there, that the people that had been staying in temporary accommodation in the park then moved elsewhere, but there was still Afad Çarşı, this temporary commercial area next to it, and the relationship with them was also a big part of it, like having this this semi temporary or medium 5-year, I think they say it is, term commercial space for people who had lost their shops. They were, every day they were coming in, these amjas were bringing you watermelon, or they were making us breakfast. Like there's such an intimate relationship with the neighborhood and the community, and the people that were the volunteers that were working were staying in the park. That they were, really in the environment, and the people coming during the day were and the children, women, men, local residents coming and wanting to be part of it, wanting to do something together. It's not quite finished, like I said. We've got a couple of members actually right now back in Kahramanmaraş trying to finish off the last stages, but this is what it looks like at the moment. And yeah, the idea is to, once it's finished, hand it over to the local community and the municipality, and they'll be able to use it as a shared community space, potentially a library space, something like this. Maybe I can hand back over.
I'll try and go through this one. Not take too long. That's right. That's what it was, just so we can get to the next part as well. So this project was in the city of Kahramanmaraş, and it was in partnership with the Chamber of Architects. As Sam has already kind of mentioned, there was a kind of space that was designated for not only the Chamber of Architects, but other kind of engineered chambers, electrical engineers, in order to kind of give them office spaces, because many people had actually lost their office spaces or used to work from home maybe partially and weren't able to anymore. And this was important in order to kind of get them on the ground and running as organizations as quickly as possible. So we already had a relationship with Mimar Oda because we knew them through Herkes İçin Mimarlık. One of them used to be a participant of Herkes İçin Mimarlık or a friend. I'm not sure exactly, but we had this relationship, and they also provided us two containers actually. One container for us to stay in when we were in the area, and one container for us to store our stuff, which was really important organizationally, because if we're bringing, one of the first things that came to our mind was, if we're bringing volunteers, we need a safe space for them to stay. We need to know we can provide certain things, a safe place to sleep, running water, etc. So this was, and the fact that we did multiple projects and were coming back and forth, it was nice to have a kind of continuous space that we could use. So the space where the containers are it was like a building plot that was designated to be, I think, new housing, but because of the earthquake, that building didn't begin, it wasn't realized, so Mimarlık took over. And the project was to build a communal space around these office spaces, so because the containers aren't the ideal kind of working environment for people coming together and having conversations in the same way that they maybe would have done. But then also now these offices are in the middle of a community. There are still people staying in the apartments surrounding the space. So in one way, making sure that architects, engineers were coming together to have conversations and, being involved in multiple levels in the conversations about what's going to happen in the city, but also having a space for the community to come and also engage in those conversations. So again, from this initial site trip, when we first went some members went in the first kind of 2 weeks, this is when this was kind of conceived as an idea. We thought we could start working with the Mimar Oda in a kind of way on different projects, but also in particular in this project. There was an open call in partnership with Istanbul University in order to kind of establish what we could potentially do for them. There was a design workshop in August, so we can see the kind of group of students coming together and then also like mocking up part of this structure. And then in August, end of August, beginning of September, there was the actual construction period where students came. And one of the first things, is it in this image or? One of the first, maybe in this you can't see super well, but in this corner image, one of the first things they actually did was, because it was so hot and they realized that some of these containers weren't really functioning very well, like there were different types of containers on the site. So one of the first things they actually did was kind of strip off some of the panels of the container to make a space, immediately kind of adapted the architecture to have a space where they could work and actually produce these pieces. So most of the materials came from the Mimar Oda themselves, and then it was 10,000 lira in individual donations. And we were working, I think, about 15 to 20 students came for the project. They also stayed on site, so it was quite a, again, intense period. This kind of staying locally to where you're building also really helps encourage this kind of relationship, in this case with the Mimar Oda and the local community. A timber, the project was made out of kind of all the same timber lengths, so again, adapting the designs based on what materials were actually available. And so this was the kind of original plan, so for seating area that could be just used, and there were actually textile coverings were added to this after the final pictures that we have here, but providing a space that the Mimar Oda could use, but also that had a function for the community. So this bit at the top is designed that it could also be maybe an outdoor cinema sometimes, or a stage area where maybe there could be presentations from the Mimar Oda to the community, or it could also take on another function, say at the weekend when people aren't working there. It's completely accessible to the public, by the way. It's not gated at all. It's very much facing the community. So there we go, some pictures of it in progress. And this is consistently a part of our ethos, is involving people, involving people in learning how to use tools, learning how to build together as a way of involving them in the building process. So students coming, everyone's involved in an equal way. Everyone's invited to participate. And this was the completed project minus just the textile hangings on top. So these are the last photographs we have of it, but this is now complete and in use. Should I do this bit? Do you want to do it? Okay, so maybe I can introduce some space and then Sam can take over. So this is the project that we were mostly involved in, so maybe we can give you the most kind of resolved summary of it. So again, in the city of Kahramanmaraş, but in a neighborhood that's kind of more on the periphery. Suma neighborhood is, before the earthquake, it was already an area that wasn't seeing much support from the government. It didn't really have any organizations that we could partner with that existed before the earthquake. So this is something that's also very important, that we realize is also important for neighborhoods when these kind of things happen, that they have some kind of existing infrastructure that can help support them. So this is Suma Ortaokul, Suma Middle School. And these are like agricultural lands, and kind of beyond this, it is just agricultural lands. The neighborhood was quite badly affected by the earthquake. And we can see here that the kind of periphery of this, what was kind of cultivated land, they didn't want people staying on this land, has been used by people to put up tents. All the roads to the side were also inhabited by people staying in tents. And CAF Collective, before we even arrived on this first visit, 2 weeks after the earthquake, had already set up, or were beginning to set up, their soup kitchen and providing food for people in the neighborhood. This was just a group of friends who came from Istanbul to try, and immediately it was kind of a bit like us, they had a connection to the neighborhood. They knew people from Marash, so that's why they decided to operate from there. So when we went on this initial site visit, we identified it as a place where we thought there's definitely a need for community space. People are staying in tents and there's no space within the neighborhood that they can access that's especially covered. And we identified CAF as a great partner to work with, so because they were providing this immediate need of food, but they were also trying to fill in some other immediate needs, like children not being able to access schools. But they were doing this just they couldn't use the school at this point because it wasn't declared safe. Well, there had been no inspection actually, so that's why we couldn't use it. So they were just using this kind of football field and this kind of car park area. So everything was happening outside, and this was still in the kind of early months of the year. So we identified that this would be a space that definitely could value from some community space. Ooh.
So yeah, one thing as well is that in Suma neighborhood, there wasn't really, even before the earthquake, kind of like Ella said, there wasn't really any existing communal space. So that was as well why I think it ended up that following the disaster, people not being able to stay in their homes, this was the only space really in close proximity that people were able to set up tents and set up any sort of temporary accommodation. You can kind of see from the top of this image, maybe not so well, but basically in the neighborhood there wasn't any shared space even before the earthquake. So the school was the only area that existed for that kind of thing. So yeah, again, it started from this site trip that we were talking about. It says here the 4th to 5th of March. We must have made it just before that, I guess. Towards the end of February, we made an open call for people to come and join a workshop primarily aimed at architecture students or design students, but also open to everybody. Obviously, as Herkes İçin Mimarlık, lots of the time the people that join our workshops already have an interest in architecture or design, but we don't limit that. We don't say you have to be a designer or an architect to come and join. So there were also, especially because of the sort of emotive relationship that people had to the disaster, there were people that came from other disciplines or weren't directly involved in architecture that wanted to come and join this workshop. So we had, I think it was over 300, it might have been even over 400 people apply to come and join this workshop. Obviously you can't hold a workshop with 400 people. So in the end it was something like 40, 45 participants came. We held it at TAC in Kadikoy. We had a design discussion about what might be needed. Obviously at this point it's kind of difficult. We were only 1 month after the earthquake had happened. It was difficult to understand what was going on the ground. So it was kind of thinking about what made sense for the short to medium to long term, like what things might make sense, what might be useful for a project. But it was very much, while there were some design outcomes, it was more kind of this focusing about like how could we begin to think about rebuilding in terms of ideas and these kind of things rather than that. There were physical design proposals as well, but it was more this kind of focus. Because we had so many people want to be involved, we then also held a forum after this at SALT Galeta, where we presented the ideas that came out of this workshop and opened the discussion up even more to, I think it was 150 people or something came to this forum. The idea being that, you know, we could get feedback on the discussion, open it up to more people, see what people think, see if it makes sense, see if these proposals that we've come up with make sense to a wider audience or a wider people of interested parties, and then they could also begin to contribute, and that discussion becomes larger. From this initial design workshop, actually, one thing that came out of it was a few of the participants that joined it proposed that one thing we could do in Suma or Turku, because it was kind of reasonably certain this would be the site of the project, is that we could start by building some sort of children's play space. So actually, before we went to Marash to begin the construction of this project, we held a small workshop in the Istanbul parks and green spaces, where they take all of the things that come out of the parks basically in Küçükçekmece. And we used pieces of play areas, etc., that had come out of parks in Istanbul, and sort of refurbished them, rearranged them into something that we would then be able to pack up, put in a lorry, take to Antakya, and reassemble when we were there. It wasn't something that I guess was so planned when we were thinking through it, but it actually ended up working as a really good tool for having a way to for us to enter those spaces and to create some sort of relationship with the community through this smaller project that was more quickly realizable, didn't have such a large, or had a shorter realization process. It enabled us to meet with the community and understand what they wanted, and also figure out where we might be able to build this community space that we are proposing and create those relationships, not just with the community, but also with administration, with other organizations working in the area, these kind of things. Then construction phase, I'll talk about a little bit more. We then ended up partnering also with this international organization, All Hands and Hearts, who were able to commit lots of labor hours and also funds as well to support this project, which as an organization that's completely volunteer based was something that we were short on, basically. And so partnering with them enabled us to, we would have realized it probably without them, but it enabled us to speed it up a lot and make it make more sense, basically. And then following that, we also did additional workshop. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end if we get time to do with occupation agency and who was looking after the space, basically. So yeah, this was what CAF Collective looked like when that first, I think this was maybe 3 or 4 weeks after, or maybe this was not quite, I can't quite remember exactly when these were taken, but this is 2 weeks after. So already 2 weeks after they were setting up these spaces. This, how do I do this pointer? I don't know how it works. Anyway, this building at the top right here was actually what turned into their kitchen. At one point, they were serving something like 10,000 meals a day to local residents because they weren't able to create their own food and they didn't have the spaces to do it. And then it also developed into, from this, actually, when we got there and when we started the construction phase, there was also a workshop space, an office space. They created a farun to bake pidehs for Ramadan. It became this whole infrastructure that was missing because of the earthquake. Basically, they were able to really quickly rebuild this infrastructure that was really essentially needed.
I think it's so important about what CAF did is they were also a small group of people and they weren't an organization before the earthquake. So they realized in order to make this work, it couldn't just be them coming and implementing this. It had to be something from within the local community as well. So they really quickly involved kind of a group of young people between the ages of maybe 16, 25 as volunteers themselves when they kind of got over this initial shock. So they were also able to kind of participate. They were volunteering in the kitchen, volunteering to support. They were kind of like liaison, we can call them maybe liaison officers, going into the tented area and finding out what people's needs were and then communicating them back to CAF. And then also CAF was then able to also start paying some other people working in the farun, people working in the from donations that were coming in. So it was very much about, the aim was to try and involve the community as much as possible. So that's also why we were really keen to work with them.
So yeah, the workshop at TAC, you can see it was pretty busy, 45, maybe it was more than that, I can't quite remember, and we in 6 different groups, and like I said, it was more sort of about ideas rather than concrete design proposals, because there wasn't a specific site. There was a rough idea of a site, but not specifically where it might be. We had this, we'd applied for funding, I think, at this point from STKB, Civil Toplum Destek Vakfi, STKB, and Turkey Mosaic Foundation, which we eventually received, which was 150,000 Turkish lira, so pretty small budget for a community space, no matter what you're doing. But because most of the labor was free and because we were also able to find support from other organizations for materials and things, it didn't quite end up coming in at that, but something over that, something just over 200,000 lira, I think. So I just wanted to share a few of their outcomes. I'm not going to go too much into specific ones, I guess, but there were some common themes that came out of it. There was lots of ideas about food and about cultural and community relationships between people and food. This is one of the things that really came out. When we ended up implementing the project, this was something we realized didn't necessarily make that much sense. Number one, because CAF were already providing it, and number two, because the amount of space that we would be able to create for something like this would only be able to facilitate a really small group of people. So I think it's not that these ideas sort of got lost, but I think it was a good exercise in exploring them, and it's something that informed also projects going forwards and our approach going forwards. It's also, I mean, about food, but it's more just about community. It's about how you come around and come together as communities. So yeah, there's a few different examples. There was also this idea of like, one other idea I think that came through was having something that was open and porous, so it wasn't just a closed space, but something that had maybe semi-open spaces as well as slightly more enclosed spaces, so that it could be multifunction, not trying to be too specific about a function because we didn't know exactly what it might be, but creating something that might be able to be used for multiple different functions. Obviously, that's a complicated issue in itself, but it was something that came through, I think. So yeah, again, this kind of very overwhelming display of all the different things that were involved, but maybe I can start with materiality. So we, again, tried to focus on materials that we'd worked with, but also that were, I guess, an alternative to the like more mainstream methods of construction in Turkey, and also enabled us to be involved in it more directly. And also as a space that we didn't know how long it was going to be there, we didn't want to, you know, you don't want to be building something that has all this energy and resources put into it if perhaps in a year, 2 years, 3 years, it might not be there anymore. Obviously, our hope is that, you know, it'd be there for 20 years and it would serve the community, but we didn't know that, so it was these kind of ideas as well. So using timber that was, at least you might be able to reuse it, or you might be able to reclaim it, and isn't super resource intensive, obviously it is. Concrete fittings, but creating them in a minimal way. I think there's a photo in one of the slides further on. I'll show you how he did these to try and like create it so that something as well. Permissions are also an issue. We haven't really talked about that, I guess, in the previous two examples. The Mimkent, the Mimarlık space was a little bit different, but the Turkolu project, that was also an issue. Finding permissions, working with administrations, working with government, but not so much actually, usually with local or the region municipalities to try and obtain some sort of permissions, which in the chaotic environment post-disaster is pretty difficult, as you can imagine. And yes, who was using it, like I said, the people staying in the tents was kind of our primary aim, wanting to provide a space for them, I guess, who are mostly neighborhood residents. Working with locals, CAF Collective, All Hands on Hearts, other volunteers, members of Herkes İçin Mimarlık who lived in places that were nearby, from Adana or Kayseri, who were able to come more easily to the site and also not put such an intense load on already really stressed resources and infrastructures and conditions. So actually, when we went to first build this, we went as a group of, very small group, 4 or 5, I think it was, maybe 6, and then there were. Yeah, we fit in one car, I guess. So it was, and because we didn't know, when we first went there, we weren't, you know, it wasn't clear where you might be able to stay. It wasn't clear what food you might be able to eat. It wasn't clear that you weren't going to be already putting stress on these kind of infrastructures. So kind of trying to minimize our that kind of impact as well was a big thing. And it worked well having people coming from, having members who already bit more local to these affected areas in Kayseri or Adana, being able to come for shorter periods of time to contribute to it without having to, you know, sort of come as a big group and stay there for an extended period of time and have to have all the resources and facilities around that. Yeah, so this, again, the construction, this one was finished at the end of May, so it's actually pretty quick after the earthquake that we finished it, but then I would call it still an ongoing project, I guess. Let me just go further forward. Okay, I'll be quick. So yeah, first of all, we built this playground. I'll just quickly took parts from that were left, the second-hand refurbished parts from playgrounds in Istanbul, transported them to Kahramanmaraş with the support of various organizations, and then reassembled them. They're basically like this kind of like, the idea being we could reasonably quickly build it. And it worked really well as this tool for getting to know the neighborhood, finding other organizations to work with, finding out how we might build this larger project that we had this idea to build that we weren't quite sure where it might work out, end up being. Do you want to talk about this?
So yeah, as Sam said, it was really I think this playground project was such a good way of us first engaging with the community and also identifying what problems and other things might come up when we're building. For example, the fact that it's amazing because there were so many children on the site who wanted to work with us, and on the scale of the playground it worked really well because we could involve them in a way that was safe. But then thinking about, if we're building something bigger, how can we make it so they feel involved, they feel like they have agency over the space, but also make it safe. And whilst we were building the playground, we were also able to think and adapt the designs for the community space based on what we were seeing. So for example, like Sam said, from this workshop, lots of things came out about food, about shared food spaces, but actually we realized that CAF kind of had food covered because they had this amazing kitchen set up. And people were kind of more, as we observed, wanted to kind of eat in there. Like they kind of set up their own small community spaces around their tents. But we realized from this time building the playground that it's actually needed a space for education, for maybe organizing in a different sort of way. So just quickly go over the things that we kind of used from that period to adapt the designs, thinking about what people had said in the workshop, but then what we were observing. So obviously the main things, people's immediate needs. So spaces for children, spaces for people to come together, but then all these other things. So the actual restrictions of the site, because we kind of had a conversation with the school. It was in a school grounds about where we could place this. They were really keen that it would be something that didn't have foundations, like strong foundations. We were also keen on this. It had a lower environmental impact. So making sure, also there were some olive trees that had been planted by the children before the earthquake. So it was communicated to us from the children very strongly that, and we wouldn't have done this anyway, hopefully, but that we would protect these olive trees. This also became something that we wanted to focus on, and not just avoid them, but make sure that we were kind of creating a space that celebrated these olive trees that were obviously important to them. Material availability. So one of the big issues is we just didn't know where to source materials from because the area where materials are stored had been very badly affected by the earthquakes. This comes again into the network of being able to talk to people to ask them, do you know if this store or warehouse has reopened? And then people power. So meeting other organizations through this, again, just through this playground project, we met other organizations who we found out could support us and could help with the process.
So yeah, these designs from the initial workshop, which I showed you, kind of ended up trying to be incorporated in the final designs, but even these final designs, you can see they're still kind of sketchy. The period between when we held that workshop and we actually started construction was something like 2 weeks, so it was like a really quick, like, okay, let's try and get something that's roughly workable, and then as we're building it, we'll resolve these issues, because we didn't know what materials to be able to find, we didn't know exactly where it would be, we didn't know, and all these things had to be adjusted. For example, one really basic constraint was because of all these suppliers having their warehouses and materials damaged, we couldn't actually find any timber that was longer than 3 meters long. So that was kind of immediately like, okay, well that kind of limits the width of the building that we can build if we're using these as roof beams, basically. These kind of like really specific constraints. So yeah, construction, finding materials from, as well, trying to get materials from the local suppliers and the local infrastructure that already exists there. Although it was very stressed, we were quite keen that we were, through building this, we weren't just buying things from outside of the earthquake areas and bringing them in. Actually, the process of where we got the materials from and the relationships we created through that also was somehow feeding back into the local community and economies and these kind of things. You can see kind of we were really lucky that CAF Collected already had this workshop set up, so they had tools and stuff that we were able to use. We bought our own tools, obviously, but having this space that we were able to secure and build things safely there and leave things there was really important, because in the chaos of post-disaster, it was, you know, this kind of boundaries of where's private and where's open is completely changed. Construction, yeah, you can see this top left photo is the photo of the workshop that CAF had, really nice little workshop. These foundations that I was talking a little bit about in this top central picture, you can kind of see they are, we basically cast, rather than building timber molds for concrete, the quickest and easiest way we could think of was to just get secondhand tires and fill them with concrete, basically as a ready-made mold, and then put a little steel foot in them. You can't really see it super well in these photos, but you can see a little bit of these steel foot that then would lift the timber structure off of the ground, so it'd be less susceptible to moisture getting into the timber. And you can see all the different people that we're working with in some of these photos. You probably won't recognize that the purple shirts are from the international organization. We were working with some of these guys on the top right are people that were both Turkish and Syrians that were living in the tents in the school grounds and had been directly themselves affected by the earthquake. So this is what it looked like in the end, that project. We had this opening event. We invited people to come and join and celebrate it, opening, celebrate the work together and kind of hand it over to the local community to use it. And yeah, you can kind of see in this photo, these are the olive trees that I didn't mention actually, but if I just quickly go, you can see in each of the corners, not very obvious, there is little circles of the building. This is where basically our site was restricted by these 4 olive trees. It was the biggest clear area that we could find, biggest rectangle in between these olive trees that we thought we could build something in. So creating something that then, you might have these seating areas around where the olive trees were, these kind of things. And then what we want to do as well, part of what Herkes İçin Mimarlık does with lots of projects, is try and open up the discussion, open up the designs and things that we created. Unfortunately, I forgot to bring it with me, but we have created this into a booklet. It's not quite 100% translated into Turkish yet, because I wrote it in English, unfortunately. But the idea being that we could then provide these designs that we'd worked on and we've proven they work. And if somebody else wanted to build a similar project, they might be able to do that. And actually, that is what happened. One of the organization that we were working with, All Hands and Hearts, built a second project based on very similar design, based on the same designs, just a slight bit larger. We supported them with adjusting the original designs. This was another site in a small town called Kalila, which was also heavily affected by the earthquakes. You can kind of see in the middle picture, it's basically right next to a container site that had been set up there. And we weren't so involved in the construction of this project. This was more this international organization that we've been working with, but the designs and all the effort that had come out of these workshops, I think really fed into this project being realized. Yeah. So maybe we can talk a little bit about the comparison between them. So I didn't really talk about it too much, but one thing that happened after the completion of the SUMO project is it wasn't really clear who was going to look after it. During the process of building it and while we were building it, everybody was staying in these temporary tents in the school grounds while we were building it. But what quickly happened is municipalities, government wanting to return to normal, moving people to more semi-permanent accommodation, to container cities and these kind of things. And as it's school and wanting to reopen their school, they basically removed 90%, all of the tents, I think, from the school grounds by the time, or soon after we finished it. So there was this project that when we first completed it, it was sort of this center of activity. Everybody was there every day. It was like really chaotic situation. But then following a few months later, kind of it was still not clear who was going to look after it and who was might take ownership over it. And while we'd hoped or tried to encourage the community to take ownership over it, in this community where there wasn't already a space like this and it was already a really deprived and challenging environment to work in, it's a difficult thing to create and to develop. And as there weren't other organizations that had been working in the area for a longer period of time, we weren't able to work with them so much. Whereas the Kalili project, so maybe this is a nice comparison in terms of the process and output orientation that we were talking about earlier. The Kalili project, I would say, is much more output oriented. We weren't really so involved in the construction of it while we were involved in the design, but the output was really successful, built right next to a container site that's been really well managed by the manager of a school that's just next to that. It's now being much more looked after. It's really, there's a couple of photos, I think, of the inside of it. They've really taken ownership over it. They've turned it into this space that's used for the community. They're organizing events using it because of the space that they didn't have before. They've also taken ownership of it, installing things like air conditioning, and I guess it's not really, this is obviously a good thing. It's a bit sad that they installed it right in front of the window, but I think it's really important that this building was really taken ownership of. The community, the administration there really took ownership of it. Unfortunately, at SUMO, not quite the same thing happened. And that was why we also, should we talk about this a little bit? We also, at the end of August, beginning of September, myself and Ella and another friend, as part of Herkes İçin Mimarlık and in collaboration with CAF Collective, who we'd already been working with, organised a short workshop where we tried to find a way to encourage or give agency to the community through this process of weaving. So we did 1 week in Istanbul, 1 week in Kahramanmaraş, and we were using as well materials that would otherwise be waste materials. I think it's something that was almost inevitable following the earthquake. Lots of materials and things were sent there, and this is kind of where the idea came from, that what happens to all these materials, and it's still a massive issue. What happens to all these containers in 5 years, 10 years' time? We don't know, we don't have the answer to them. But one thing we picked up on was that there's probably lots of waste textiles because of the earthquake. Also, never mind the earthquake, it's a massive issue anyway. So trying to use these materials that are already basically waste materials that would be wasted anyway and then doing this process of weaving, which we worked with students from E2 as well as from abroad, from Madrid, and somebody also came from Delft, to develop these skills and learn together, and then take it to the Suma neighborhood and try and use this as a tool to activate this space and encourage people to take ownership of it. I think we're yet to see whether it's a successful project long term, but it's something that I think we can say is ongoing. Do you want to talk? Yeah,
because it feels like it's a nice way of summing it up. Yeah, I think this was such a just doing this extra workshop afterwards, and we are still also thinking about how we can continue this relationship. We are also checking in with the school to find out if we can still support them in any way to maybe adapt the building to make it more suitable for the school. It's right at the back of the school, so although it's further away from the community, it's actually still kind of used, like that space is maybe used more by the community. So there's still kind of a chance that we're trying to still encourage the idea that it could still be open, it's not gated off, but like that it won't be gated off. But I think doing this workshop really demonstrated to us this, how difficult this is and how it has to be such an ongoing process, and why it's so important to partner with like local organizations in order to, keep these things going and to keep encouraging people to feel the space is theirs, because this was a kind of a common thing that people were coming up to us and they were like addressing. They were saying to us directly, we didn't necessarily know how to use this space. Like we didn't feel like it was just for us, so we don't want to use it by ourselves. But then there's no events going on, so this is the problem. But the weaving was a great thing because it immediately resonated with children. We had loads of children involved. But also we tried to do something going backwards, going into the community and then to the space, and then into the community and then to the space. So for example, I don't know if there's a photo, maybe on the top right, we tried to bring the looms initially actually on a market day to the market space in the neighborhood. So it's kind of temporary, reoccurring community space that happens every week anyway, and do the weaving there. And we found out, maybe for the future, something to keep in mind, that this was a great way of involving local residents who weren't, not just children, but also women and men came up to us to ask us what we were doing to join in. So yeah, I think.
So maybe, I think in terms of like our completed projects, I think that's pretty much what there are other ongoing projects. Not to say that this is everything, we're also working on other projects. And maybe just very briefly, we can mention something that we were involved in recently, myself and Ella, another member of Herkes İçin Mimarlık. Initially we started working more in Kahramanmaraş because this is where Herkes İçin Mimarlık's existing contacts were. But through this development and through also creating further networks with existing with initiatives and platforms that had sort of sprung up following the disaster. We've now also begun sort of doing a couple of projects in Antakya. The first one I'll just briefly mention was a forum. The first stage of this project is a forum, or was a forum, that we held 3 weeks ago, I can't quite remember when it was, alongside Architects Sans Frontières UK and also the Chamber of Architects of Hatay. And it was more sort of a beginning forum this session, where we were trying to bring these different platforms together and trying to find out what they wanted. There isn't a physical idea of what will happen, or it isn't a specific outcome that we're looking at, but it's more working with Architects Sans Frontières UK, which are more involved in this sort of, have previous experience doing, I mean, we obviously as well, but in different situations across the world, doing this sort of capacity building of how communities and how people can have their voices empowered and take ownership and have further agency in the rebuilding process, which I think in Antakya will be really important, because, I mean, Kahramanmaraş is still in a really difficult situation, but from our experience, I think Antakya has a long way to go. Yeah, and there's also another project we're working on with Ali Ismail Korkmaz Foundation. We haven't really covered it here, but that was also quite a complicated project, but just there's more going on and there's more things. We have a website, if you're interested and you want to see, it basically has all the information that we covered. There's, like I said, we try and make everything as open source and accessible as possible. So there's details and photos from all of our projects, there's the outcomes, there's designs, all these kind of things that you should be able to find. Yeah, thank you so much for listening. And yeah, if you have any questions, or maybe I can...
Again, I want to thank you very much for joining us, Ella and Sam. It was a quite introduction, sharing your experiences and the knowledge that you've been through, honestly. Maybe I can start with my questions, Joe? Yeah, thank you. I mean, I quite have so many questions, but I'm going to leave some of them for my friends. But okay, one of the things that I want to know, okay, before maybe I start that, I like the concept that you're trying to work in accordance to your abilities, which is something, in my opinion, very important, because sometimes we overestimate ourselves, we are over ambitious, and we really want to do something, but we end up overshooting the goal, I guess. So that was a positive point, in my opinion. But I have one question, or maybe two. First of all, is regarding Kahramanmaraş. I know that there was a project that have been worked with Nevzat Sen, I guess, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, the question is, usually approaching people or the communities after a disaster, or even, let's say, a local village, they kept to be worried about what's going to happen in the, let's say, school or in the area that they will be living in, because sometimes they think that you know, a huge project might be happening or something. So they tend to be scared or afraid about the projects that, you know, usually come this way. So that's one question. So how do you approach them? The second of all is why, or I don't know if you did, but have you thought about creating maybe interventions into the fabric of the cities or the villages that you guys were working on? I mean, since you can't build a huge project, or let's say a very wide building, I don't know, maybe creating some sort of an interventions throughout the fabric of the city or the villages that you guys are working in. Did you thought about it, or did you not? And if you did, maybe you can share some of your experiences. Thank you very much.
So this one about people's concerns about what's going to happen and what's future. So I think it's just, for us, it was we didn't have those answers for them, because we also didn't know what was going to happen. So for it, maybe we can use Summer School as an example, because there was so much, one of the main concerns of the families, their children were actually enrolled in this school, and they wanted, especially over the summer months when it was coming more towards, their children already lost out on a lot of education, is they wanted to know, for example, when will this school open? What's the, even though they were maybe staying close to the school, what's the future of the school, and what does this mean for our neighborhood? Also, we know that other neighborhoods are seeing engineers coming to support them, checking out houses. When's that going to happen to our neighborhood? Is that, you know, these concerns that maybe this will happen and it will force maybe this community to be pushed out of the neighborhood? There's all these concerns, but was so out of our capacity to answer these questions that we just our aim was always just to make sure that the community always knew what we were doing and knew that how the constraints of our project, because people were also seeing us as outsiders, so seeing us as maybe having answers that we definitely didn't have, especially regarding the school. Like, it was something that came up a lot. So just voicing their concerns when we could. So for example, we maybe had contacts because we were reaching people, so voicing them, but that was all we could do actually. Like we were in the similar, so I think that's maybe such an important part of Herkes İçin Mimarlık. By involving the community, we try to alleviate those concerns, or not become a pressure group, but become a group who then communicate these concerns to the other levels that we can maybe like interact with.
Yeah, I guess I'd also say on this, usually the way Herkes İçin Mimarlık projects work is there's much more of a developed community-based design and problem resolution stage, but obviously in post-earthquake conditions, that is not really possible. There wasn't the opportunity for that. But even so, I think the process of building together, I think the process of building spaces together and doing things together, and myself and Ella obviously come across as outsiders, as Herkes İçin Mimarlık in general came across as an outsider, but as an organization, we are, apart from us, 100% Turkish. So I think that also helps when we're not an international organization, although those organizations were really needed and were really welcomed by communities, I think. It helped to, show that we're on the same, or we can communicate in a way and understand things in a way which has a larger, more formal, Herkes İçin Mimarlık is a formal organization, but as a larger, more corporate or more international organization, it'd be more difficult to do. And then for your question, I think, of course, this would be a lovely idea to integrate things more throughout the city fabric, but I think one of the things that I kind of addressed a little bit is permissions and stuff in the post-disaster conditions. It's like so chaotic and so hard to, even the building of these spaces, they took like weeks of like discussions and going back and forth and asking one person, and at the last minute having somebody else say, what are you doing? You can't build here. So the idea that you could just go into the city and build something where you want it is just not how it worked. You might be able to, but in 2 weeks it probably wouldn't be there. So it's like we were trying to find ways to create things that I guess they might not be there for 100 years, but maybe they'll be there for 2, maybe they'll be there for 5, maybe they'll be there for 20, who knows, but trying to create things that weren't just going to get knocked down in 2 weeks, sort of thing. Yeah.
What's that? You're the lucky one.
Thank you very much for sharing the experience. They're all very inspiring projects. I was wondering, the Sumer project, the lessons learned, the challenges you face, and are there any observations that you made for the Kılılı project? What was improved, because it was quite larger, I guess? So, thank you.
Yeah, so I guess the size was more constrained by the site in the Sumer site, but that was the largest we were able to create it. The Kılılı site, I didn't actually explain super well, I guess, but basically the design was very simple. It's basically a series of portal structures, and the Sumer had 5 of them, and the Kılılı had 6 of them. So it's not a huge amount bigger, but an extra sort of 20% or something, but it felt a bit bigger, I guess, the space. Also, there were other changes that developed through availability of materials and things like this, and funding, budget, all these kind of things that we don't have a whole lot of control over. Like you can kind of see, if I go to maybe if I quickly go through, sorry. I can show you a little bit, at least then you've got a reference to look at. Sorry, we're all the way at the end now. This paneling material that we used on the outside of here was basically a material that came from another local company. It's a composite panel, some sort of plastic, but the reason we chose it is because it was just what was available at the time. When you were going to the industrial areas of Kahramanmaraş and looking for materials, like so much of it had been damaged by the warehouses falling down, all these kind of things that we just there wasn't a whole lot of choice for these kind of things. With the Kılılı project, it was a little bit, they started after the completion of this first one, or about the same time as it completed, and they already had sort of like, through us being there and working with organizations, we enlarged that network, I guess, through working with certain people, you then get in contact with other people, and that then enlarged the sort of amount of materials that they were able to resource. So for example, they clad it in this timber cladding material, which I think is a good thing in the end. And also the windows and things changed slightly to do with things like on this first one, we didn't put a whole lot of glass or polycarbonate or anything in because we weren't 100% certain we would be able to source it. But once they'd figured out where to source it, they were able to say, okay, we can add more windows, or it makes more sense to put these openings on this wall because it's easier to construct. These kind of things. The roof was also from a composite panel in the Kalila project, so something that had a little bit of insulation, partly again to do with constraints of how the organization that built it worked with. They basically weren't able to construct the roof themselves for their organization health and safety restrictions. Whereas in the SUMA space, we just used what we could get hand of. So it was this corrugated iron with a layer of membrane, this bitumen stuff underneath, and then also some OSB underneath that. So similar effects, but not quite as easy to install in the end. There are also things like, and this was actually something that we kind of, I guess I didn't really explain, we kind of had to fight for as well, like working with this organization. They're obviously working with low-skilled labor. They're working with volunteers coming from all over the world, and they were saying these things like, we just want to install single doors everywhere because it's much easier to build. Doors take a lot of time. And it took a lot of back and forth of us going, this is a community space. We think this very simple thing, having double doors, will actually make quite a big difference in how it's able to be used in the summer, especially because we didn't have the money and we didn't have the time and the resources to install insulation and stuff like that. So it's working with what you've got to then try and create the best that you can get to. And part of the idea of leaving the, you can kind of see a little bit in the top right-hand photo, of leaving the inside panels exposed and not cladding them, was that perhaps we could come back and install insulation. It's also a financial constraint. We didn't have money to clad the inside of it, but like these kind of ideas of making most with what we could do, and that changed from one project to the next, I guess.
I think it's such an important question. I think it's also about, the thing that I think we learned is that it's so much about the existing provisions as well for the communities, and how the communities were able to function based on, for example, like their needs being fulfilled before the earthquake. And that's why like it's really important that we didn't see these as like, for example, one being more successful than the other, because when we were there, it was when we brought the students from Itu, they were seeing that Kalila was kind of like functioning a lot better, like children were able to engage with them and it kind of had more concentration. It felt kind of like less chaotic, but that's also, I think, partly because they had these provisions. The container Kent, they had this head teacher who was monitoring the space, making sure they were taking care of it, and really kind of proud of this work that he was doing. And I think this was something that existed in that neighborhood, this sense of community before the earthquake, whereas in Suman neighborhood, there were so many existing problems before the earthquake to do with kind of community fractures between different groups, to do with the lack of this kind of feeling that they were being, not just feeling, the truth that they were being kind of deprived from the local agencies. And we saw this after the earthquake. People were telling us we didn't see anyone from a local agency, and this was months after the earthquake. We're not getting access to things like tents. We're having a much higher kind of population of people staying in one tent compared to other areas. Why is this? So I think these things all contribute to how then the space was being used afterwards. And I think it's why it's so important that we have these that we acknowledge that these are things that we can't just solve through maybe through architecture or through these these like things that we place there, but that it needs like a much longer relationship with the community. And that's something that I think we learn and that we're trying to also work on still. Thank you for the question. Anyone else?
Thank you so much for the presentation and for sharing your works and details. It was really informative, to be honest with you. I envy the efforts that you have put in, especially when it's an NGO and non-profitable at the same time. It requires a lot of energy and motivation. At the same time, I want to ask again about the same project. Since you have constructed it with two different materials, and I know also previously you mentioned the Super Adobe, which I believe was a collaboration with Kulub as well. Kuluba, yeah. And so for this second version of it, the one that uses this wooden panels, because I follow some of Koliba's work as well, and I've seen them use mud and straw as sort of an insulative materials. Was maybe such strategies maybe thought to be implemented in here, or maybe perhaps you did think about it, but then the smell or or whatever it is, the second thought of using that material would not have worked. Anyway, beside that, the second important question for me is that have these projects activated, let's say, other NGOs or other maybe other people locally, local NGOs, or I want to say local communities in the area? We have made a visit to Hatay as well, and last week, and specifically visited Samanda, and we met with a lot of people in there. Kadın Kulubu, which is like a cooperative, Kadın Cooperative, Women Cooperative, which it actually initiated even before the earthquake, and they're still working very hard, actually trying to build themselves up and the area. And I'm wondering if such thing could actually connect to such cooperatives, maybe perhaps, either for sponsoring the materials or maybe perhaps expanding those projects. And unfortunately, the permissions required to build these, as you already said, quite difficult. But I'm kind of curious about its limitation in terms of a division, or giving the feeling of segregation. I know that's not your intention, of course, but when we did our visit, we felt like some people were feeling that left out. You also mentioned it, right? When is this going to happen? When is the school going to open? And perhaps did this project invoked such feelings maybe? And so how do we prevent them, or build hope actually for the others? So removing the border, even though this was in this school area, which is kind of like gated-ish area. So how do we remove that gate? Maybe not physically, but you know what I mean, contextually, maybe, so to speak. No, sorry.
Would you like to take one of them? Should I take the last question and you do the first one?
Yeah. So the first question about other materials and these kind of things, of course, this is things that we thought about. We had, hours and hours of meetings with all different kind of organizations that you don't get to see in the end production. We had meetings with people who built super Adobe projects in other parts of Turkey. We had meetings with people who have, or discussions with people who have really like experience in using other natural materials, straw and these kind of things, or alternative to straw, if straw is not available, rice husks or other kind of byproducts from these industries. And of course, we would have loved to be able to realize something like that. But in the end, it comes down, I guess, economic position. That doesn't come easily. It's not easy to devote time to completing these projects. One other thing to do with like these kind of straw projects is, like I say, logistics. The way lots of these projects worked was finding local suppliers and using local networks, and we just didn't have a connection. But we did look into it, and we are still considering these kind of things, but we didn't have a local connection where we could get that material from. And if you don't have a local connection where you can get that from, then it's not really possible, and especially in the chaotic conditions of a... Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say we also reached out. Straw was something we really considered, and we reached out to an expert from Turkey, but from the UK, who we had a contact with. But it was actually really a problem that was voiced by lots of people, is sourcing straw in Turkey, because it has such a demand for feed for animals and agricultural use. It's kind of actually hard to find somewhere to source. I'm sure we could have done, but at that time, it was a material we wanted to work with. I think also part of the material choice was just about, I think one way it was a success in all the different projects, from this Super Adobe to this project as well, was also trying to encourage the idea that building with different materials is actually like a possibility. Lots of people coming up to us and saying like, this could be nice for like a house, for example. Like local people were saying, oh wow, like we could build this, we built this with you, kind of, and then now we could build this for ourselves, like whether that's something that will happen, but in a neighborhood that is, predominantly concrete built buildings, and we've seen even they were mostly important piece of information about the neighborhood, single-story, two-story buildings built out of concrete. So just kind of suggesting these alternative material choices, not imposing them on people, but just kind of saying they're out there, we can work with them. They lend them. The reason that Herkes İçin Mimarlık picks these materials is because they're materials that other people can work with. Like concrete pouring, of course you can do it communally, but it doesn't quite have the same thing as standing around together, working on a piece of wood in order to kind of, cut pieces together, having this communication that goes on. And for the second question, I think this is, so Sümer Mahallesi is maybe like such a specific example, because that was a struggle to find local communities to work, local organizations to work with. But with the other projects, we did work with maybe not communities, but at least had a much better relationship with the municipality, which was really important in terms of, all these different issues, permissions, actually being able to realize things, but also trying to encourage like a feeling of trust with the neighborhood. But I agree, like it's really hard to give everybody a sense of agency over a space and to involve everybody, and to not, by giving maybe involving one group, not making another group feel kind of disenfranchised. This is something that I think Herkes İçin Mimarlık are constantly trying to rework our process and address, because and when you work in different contexts, you realize how this manifests itself. For example, in Sümer, there being friction between the Turkish and Syrian community, then it became an issue when we were working all together. And unfortunately, there were some frictions that came out of this that we weren't anticipating, and that doesn't work with our ethos at all of involving everyone, but it became a kind of an issue in bringing people together through the building process. So that is why existing local community organizations are so important. I completely agree. And in terms of making people feel like the space is for them, I think that is the step, is working with local organizations, because then they already have that feeling that they are part of something. So it comes together a lot easier, rather than us just bringing a space and saying it's for you. Like it doesn't translate in the same way. It doesn't work in the same way.
Maybe I can just add one thing on that. I think maybe we didn't stress it enough during the thing, but I think when we look at the projects that we've completed so far, I think there's two things that we try to do, or that they all kind of hopefully do to some degree. One is they offer an alternative to the existing method, or the most likely method of building, and in a hopefully more sustainable or more approachable way. And the second one is that all spaces, although like you say, they are still not open to everybody, they're all spaces that hopefully create or provide spaces for discussion. So to give people agency, to create a space where, because these are the spaces that were not being addressed by municipalities or other organizations. The most important thing for lots of those organizations was immediate shelter, and that was really important. But as Herkes İçin Mimarlık, we were able to provide, well, that's how we positioned ourselves, to provide something where communities could find spaces to come together, and through that, then hopefully have more of a voice together in what might happen next. And I think maybe with this projects that we're hopefully beginning and will be continuing working on in Antakya, this is the sort of way that we've started this, working with various different initiatives and platforms that are still very active throughout Antakya, and are still really, really necessary as well.
Thank you very much again for joining us. Actually, we are looking forward for the upcoming project that you have, because it's kind of in the same region that we are working in as well. again, thank you very much. No, no worries, you're welcome.